There are things that get said in public spaces every single day that should not be said. Things that reveal, in one unguarded sentence, exactly what a person thinks about who counts and who does not, who deserves to be in the room and who is there by some kind of mistake. Most of those moments pass without consequence, without anyone with enough authority in the room to name what just happened and decide that it is not going to be treated as normal. This is a story about one of the rare moments when that did not happen. When a man said something that should not have been said, in front of a studio full of people, and the man standing at the center of that studio. A man who has never once in his professional life been accused of not knowing what a room needs, looked at him and said, clearly and without any version of apology, that this was not going to be the kind of place where that was allowed to stand. If you believe that every person who walks through a door deserves to be treated as fully human, every person, regardless of how they move through the world or what their body can and cannot do, then this story is going to mean something to you. Hit that like button and subscribe right now before we go any further, because stories about dignity and the people who defend it are exactly what this channel is for, and we bring one every single week. Now let us talk about the Nguyen family and what happened on that stage. The Nguyen family from San Jose, California arrived at the Family Feud studio in the spring of 2024 with the particular energy of a family that has done a lot of hard things together, and has emerged from all of them still genuinely enjoying each other's company, which is not as common as people like to think. The team was built around 44-year-old Linda Nguyen, who was the kind of person you would describe as a force of nature if that phrase had not been so thoroughly worn down by overuse. She was a speech therapist who had spent 17 years working primarily with children who had communication challenges, children with autism, children who had experienced strokes or brain injuries, children whose words lived somewhere inside them that they had not yet found a way to get to the outside. She was gifted at her work in the way that the best professionals in any field are gifted, not just technically but humanly, with the specific patience and creativity and refusal to give up that makes the difference between a therapist and a transformational therapist. She had 3 children of her own, which she often said was the best professional development she had ever received. Her husband, Min, was 47 and had been a high school math teacher for 20 years. He was quiet in the particular way of people who are not shy, but who have learned that most conversations benefit from more listening than people usually give them. And he had the calm, precise humor of someone who has spent 2 decades in a room full of teenagers and has had to develop a very efficient comedic instinct as a survival strategy. Their eldest child, Kevin, was 22 and had recently graduated with a degree in computer science. Their daughter Mai was 19 and in her 2nd year of college studying nursing. And the 5th member of the team was Linda's brother, Thomas, who was 41 years old and who had been using a wheelchair since a spinal cord injury in a car accident 11 years earlier, and who had, in the 11 years since that accident, built a life that would have been impressive by any measure, even without the context of what he had navigated to build it. Thomas ran a small landscaping business that he had started 4 years ago, initially on his own, that now employed 8 people. He was also, by the account of every single member of his family, the funniest person any of them had ever met, which, in a family that included Min, was saying something. The competing family that day was the Brennan family from Phoenix, Arizona. There were 5 of them, all adult cousins and siblings, loud, fast, clearly competitive. The kind of family that had been playing games against each other their entire lives and had developed strong opinions about strategy and equally strong opinions about themselves. The team captain was 39-year-old Craig Brennan, who managed a chain of auto parts stores and who had, in his pregame segment with Steve Harvey, established himself as someone who liked to talk, liked to joke, and had a certain way of inhabiting a room that assumed the room was there for him. He was not without charm. He was quick, and he was funny in the broad, easy way of someone who has always gotten laughs and has perhaps stopped thinking too carefully about what exactly is generating them. Everything was normal through the opening warm-up. Both families were energetic. Both were getting comfortable with the cameras and the lights, and the specific slightly surreal experience of being in a television studio when you have never been in one before. Steve Harvey was doing what he does in those early minutes, making people feel like they are exactly where they belong, drawing out the parts of each family that the audience should know, finding the moments of warmth and humor that make the whole thing feel less like a formal event and more like a good afternoon with interesting people. He had got to Thomas and was asking him about the landscaping business, which Thomas was describing with the particular mix of pride and self-deprecating humor that characterized everything he talked about, when Craig Brennan said it. It was framed as a joke. They almost always are. He said something about how the Nguyen family had brought a ringer because nobody was going to buzz in against someone in a wheelchair without worrying they would look bad, so they basically had a free answer every round. He delivered it with a grin, the grin of someone who has confused making people uncomfortable with making them laugh. He said it to his family, not to the room, but with the volume and the projection of someone who is not actually making a private comment, but is broadcasting in the direction of an audience, and relying on the plausible deniability of having technically aimed the words elsewhere. Thomas Nguyen heard it. He looked up from his conversation with Steve Harvey with an expression that was not anger, not the sharp, hot kind that arrives fast and shows itself obviously. It was something quieter than that. The expression of someone who has been in rooms where this kind of thing gets said before and has developed a relationship with the moment of hearing it that is complicated in ways that take years to understand. His sister Linda, standing 2 feet away, also heard it. She did not say anything. She looked straight ahead at Steve Harvey with the particular composure of someone who is deciding, in real time, whether this is a moment that requires her to speak or whether someone else is going to handle it. Someone else was going to handle it. Steve Harvey had heard it. He had been in mid-sentence with Thomas when the comment reached him, and there was a moment, a very brief moment, where he continued the sentence, finished it, and then stopped. He turned his head slowly in the direction the comment had come from. He looked at Craig Brennan with the careful, deliberate attention of someone who is making sure he has understood correctly what he heard, and who has already decided what he is going to do once he has confirmed it. The production crew, which had been moving with the easy efficiency of a team that had done this 1,000 times, went still in the way crews go still when they can see from across a room that something has shifted in the energy on stage, and that the next 30 seconds are going to require their full attention. Steve walked to the center of the stage. Not quickly, not dramatically. With the measured pace of someone who has somewhere specific to go and is going to get there at exactly the speed that demonstrates he is not rattled by anything. "I want to stop for a second," he said. His voice was the same voice he always used, the same volume, the same timbre, but the quality in it was different. The warmth was not gone, but it had moved to the back of the room behind something harder and more direct. "I heard what was just said. And I want to address it because this is my stage and I'm responsible for what happens on it." Craig Brennan, who had been smiling, stopped smiling. "A comment was just made about this man," Steve said, and he gestured toward Thomas, "about his wheelchair and about how it might affect this game, and it was delivered as a joke." He paused. "I want to be very clear about something. There was nothing funny about it. Not because it was aimed at something serious. Plenty of jokes are about serious things and are funny. This was not funny because it reduced a person to the thing they use to move around in the world. It said, without actually saying it, your disability is the most interesting thing about you. It is the thing I am going to reach for when I want to say something about you." He looked at Craig directly. "That is not a joke. That is a way of seeing someone. And it's a way of seeing someone that I'm not okay with on this stage." Craig started to say something about how it was not meant that way, that he had not meant any offense. Steve let him say it. Then Steve said, with the patient specificity of someone who has been thinking about what they are going to say and is going to say all of it, "I understand you didn't mean to cause offense, but I want to ask you something, and I genuinely want you to hear it as a question and not as an attack. When you look at Thomas, when you look at that man over there who took the time to come here today, who runs a business, who is somebody's brother and somebody's family member and somebody who has a whole life that has nothing to do with that chair, is his chair really the first thing you reach for? Is that the most important thing you've got to say about him?" The studio was very quiet. "Because I'll tell you what I see," Steve continued, and now he looked at Thomas directly, not at Craig. "I see a man who started a business from scratch, who employs people, who showed up here today with his family to have a good time and play a game. And I see a man who just sat here and listened to a comment like that in a room full of strangers and kept his composure in a way that I am going to go ahead and tell you, most people in this room, most people including myself, would have had a much harder time doing." He looked back at Craig. "He's already demonstrated more grace in the last 60 seconds than the comment deserved. I'd like us to try to get to that level for the rest of this taping." Craig Brennan did not contest it. There was a moment where it seemed like he might, where he opened his mouth and then thought better of it, and in that choice, small as it was, he showed something that made the rest of the afternoon possible. He looked at Thomas. He said, directly and without the covering humor, that the comment was wrong and that he was sorry he had made it. It was not a speech. It was not an elaborate apology. It was a sentence, said to a person's face, with the straightforward acknowledgement of someone who has just been shown clearly what they did and has decided not to spend energy defending it. Thomas Nguyen received it with the same quiet composure he had brought to the moment before it, not with immediate forgiveness performed for the room, not with magnanimous grace that turned the other person's error into his opportunity to look good, but with a simple nod that said, "Heard." And then he looked at Steve Harvey, and then he looked at his family, and then he said something that the studio audience would be talking about for the rest of the day. "Can we play now?" he said. "Because I drove a long way to win some money." The audience went up, not with the polite applause of people responding to a scripted moment, with the real, warm, involuntary sound of 200 people who have just been watching something heavy and have just been given permission to breathe again by someone who handled the heavy thing and then moved through it with total ease. Steve Harvey laughed genuinely with his whole face and pointed at Thomas and said, "That man right there. That is who we are playing with today." What followed was one of the most enjoyable games of Family Feud that anyone in that studio had seen in months. Not because anything else dramatic happened, nothing did, but because the Nguyen family, freed from the tension that had been sitting on the opening minutes of the taping, played with a looseness and a joy that was infectious in the way only genuine enjoyment ever is. Thomas, it turned out, was exactly as funny as his family had always maintained. He had a gift for survey answers that came from a specific kind of social intelligence. The ability to understand not just what people think, but how they think, the patterns and instincts and assumptions that drive 100 random people to give the same answer to the same question. He credited it in a post-game exchange with Steve to 11 years of watching the world from an angle that most people do not, which gave him, he said, an unusually clear view of how people move through spaces and what they assume and what they take for granted. He said it with humor, but also with a precision that made it clear he had thought about it seriously and that the insight was real. Linda, the speech therapist, was fast and lateral in her thinking, the same qualities that made her exceptional with children who needed to find unexpected pathways to their words made her exceptional at this. At finding the unexpected pathway to the answer that a survey had already confirmed was the most common one. Min was steady and exact. Kevin and I played with the competitive ease of young adults who grew up in a family where the dinner table was never boring and who therefore have very strong instincts about when to press and when to pass. The Nguyen family won the main game. They went into fast money with the momentum of a team that has been playing for something larger than the prize and knows it. Linda went first in fast money and scored 121 points. Thomas went second. He rolled to the podium with the practiced ease of someone who has spent 11 years figuring out how to do every single thing he does, and he sat there with the 20-second clock visible above him, and he looked at Steve Harvey and said, before Steve had even asked the first question, "Hit me." Steve Harvey grinned. He hit him. Thomas answered 5 questions in 20 seconds with the specific, uncanny accuracy of someone who has spent a very long time watching people and understanding them. 4 of his 5 answers landed in the top 2 spots on the board. His final answer, to a question about something people do when they are running late, was the #1 response on the survey by a margin that made the board reveal feel like a punctuation mark on everything that had already happened. The Nguyen family's combined total was 289 points. They had won the $20,000. The applause when the total went up was sustained and genuine in the way applause is when a room has been on a journey with the people being applauded and is releasing something accumulated over the full length of the experience rather than just responding to the moment. Steve Harvey crossed to Thomas first. He held out his hand. Thomas took it. They looked at each other for a moment, both of them knowing what the afternoon had contained, and Steve said quietly, not for the cameras, though the cameras caught it, "You are something else, man. I mean that." Thomas, who had spent the last 2 hours being exactly himself in front of a national television audience, said, "I know." And then he smiled the smile of someone who has been saying that to the world for 11 years in different ways, and is completely at ease with the fact that most of the world takes a while to catch up. The episode aired 6 weeks later. The clip of Steve's response to Craig Brennan's comment, his measured, specific, unhurried address to both the man who had made the comment and the man it had been made about, spread through disability advocacy communities online within hours of the broadcast. Organizations that worked on accessibility and disability rights shared it extensively, not as an example of a viral moment, but as a teaching tool, as a demonstration of what it looked like when someone responded to ableism in real time without minimizing it, without making excuses for it, and without turning it into an opportunity to perform outrage rather than actually address the thing. The specificity of what Steve had said, about the wheelchair being the first thing reached for, about reducing a person to the method by which they move through the world, was noted by disability advocates as unusually precise for an off-the-cuff response. Several wrote that it reflected an understanding of how ableism actually operates, not just as individual rudeness, but as a pattern of perception that makes a single characteristic the defining feature of a whole person. Thomas Nguyen gave an interview to a disability-focused media outlet 2 months after the episode aired. He said the thing he was most frequently asked was how he had maintained his composure in the moment after Craig's comment, and that his honest answer was that it was the composure of familiarity. He said that when you have been navigating the world in a wheelchair for 11 years, you have encountered the moment where someone reduces you to the chair so many times that you have had to develop a considered relationship with how you respond to it. Not because the moment stops being offensive. It does not. But because you learn quickly that your reaction to it has consequences for you that are separate from, and often larger than its consequences for the person who caused it. He said he had decided a long time ago that he was not going to spend his emotional energy on people who were not worth the invoice. He said Steve Harvey's response had meant something to him not because it changed the moment had already passed, but because it was a demonstration in front of a large audience that the way he had been treated was not normal and not acceptable, and that having someone with Steve Harvey's platform say that out loud, clearly and without hedging, had value that went beyond the specific incident. He talked about his landscaping business. He talked about the 8 people who worked for him, several of whom had their own disabilities and who had come to him specifically, because he had built a company where that was not a barrier or a story, but simply a fact about a person, the same way being left-handed is a fact about a person. He said the most important thing he had learned in 11 years of running a business and living a life from a wheelchair was that the limitations people placed on him in their minds were almost always larger than any practical limitation he actually encountered. That the hardest thing about disability in his experience was not the disability. It was other people's imagination of what the disability meant. He said he had built his whole business on the belief that a person's capacity had nothing to do with their diagnosis and everything to do with their decision about what they were going to do with what they had. He said he tried to hire accordingly and live accordingly, and he had found it worked. Linda, watching the interview from her living room, texted him afterward with one word: exactly. He texted back a photograph of his crew at a job site, 8 people standing in front of a newly landscaped yard, grinning at the camera, one of them Thomas, his chair at an angle that put him in the center of the frame. The yard looked excellent. The crew looked proud. Thomas looked like someone who has spent 11 years deciding who he is going to be and is satisfied with the decision. The prize money went, in part, toward a piece of adaptive equipment that Thomas had been looking at for 2 years for one of his employees, a modification to a work vehicle that would make that employee's job significantly more manageable. He told his family about it at the next Sunday dinner, the way he told them most things, without ceremony, as a practical decision he had made, offered as information rather than as a story about himself. His mother, who was 72 and had watched her son navigate 11 years of things she would have wished away from him if she could, put her hand over his at the dinner table and did not say anything for a moment. He looked at her and said, "Ma, stop. We won the money fair." She laughed. She could not stop the tears, but she laughed. That is, when you think about it, exactly the right response to a lot of things. The Brennan family, Craig specifically, is not a villain in this story, and it is worth saying that clearly. What Craig said was wrong and it deserved to be addressed, and Steve Harvey addressed it. But Craig also, in the moment that followed, did the thing that actually matters after a moment like that. He acknowledged it, and he apologized without insisting on a particular kind of reception for the apology. He did not make his contrition into a performance that required Thomas to perform forgiveness in return. He said what he needed to say, and he let it be what it was. That is not nothing. People who have never been in that position, who have never had the experience of having said something they regret and being called on it in front of a room, sometimes underestimate how hard the simple version of accountability actually is to do. Craig Brennan did the simple version. It was enough. The Brennan family played the rest of the game with a different energy than they had walked in with, more careful, more attentive to the room, less concerned with establishing themselves as the most entertaining presence in the space, and more concerned with simply playing the game and being decent people while doing it. They did not win, but they did not disgrace themselves further either, and by the time the taping ended there was nothing in the room that felt unresolved. Steve Harvey, who had handled every beat of the afternoon with the judgment of someone who understands exactly what his platform is for, wrapped the taping with the specific warm closure that he is genuinely extraordinary at, the closing energy that makes a room feel like it contains something real, and sends everyone home carrying it correctly. The thing about disability is that it is everywhere. It is in the family of almost everyone reading this right now. A parent, a sibling, a cousin, a child, a friend who navigates the world with a body or a mind that works differently than what the world was mostly built for. It is more common than most people's daily lives make it feel, because the world does an effective job of making disabled people less visible in many of the spaces where visibility is valued. Thomas Nguyen had a landscaping business and a family and a sense of humor sharp enough to cut glass, and the first thing a stranger reached for when trying to say something about him was the chair. That is not unusual. That is the norm that people like Thomas spend their entire lives working against, not the chairs or the ramps or the adaptive equipment, but the version of them that lives in other people's heads before they have bothered to look at the whole person. Steve Harvey looked at the whole person. And then he made sure a room full of people understood that the whole person was what they were going to be looking at for the rest of the afternoon. That is the job, not just the hosting job, the human one. If this story reached you, if it made you think about someone in your own life who moves through the world differently and who you might be seeing as a fraction of who they actually are, let that thought go somewhere useful. Ask the question you have not asked. Pay the attention you have been meaning to pay. Leave a comment below and tell us what Thomas's story made you think about, because this community takes those comments seriously, and so do we. And if you are not already here with us, subscribe right now, because every single week we come back with stories exactly like this one. Stories about the people this world underestimates. Stories about what it looks like when someone refuses to be made smaller than they are. And stories about the moments when someone with a platform uses it to say, clearly and without flinching, "Not here. Not on this stage. Not on my watch. We will see you in the next one."